The clatter of iron, a sharp hiss of leather, then a suffocating silence. Under the unforgiving glare of the desert sun, a young woman stood on a makeshift wooden block, her hands bound in front of her with coarse rope. The air in the hidden canyon was thick with dust and the stench of unwashed bodies. A crowd of hard-faced men, miners, drifters, and foremen stared up at her, their eyes cold and assessing, like they were bidding on a mule. The auctioneer, a portly man with a stained vest, wiped a slick of sweat from his brow. "Next one up," he barked, his voice grating. Fresh off the boat a year ago, now a widow. Name's Mai. Her husband met his maker on the railroad line, left his debts behind. She's strong, but she's quiet. Won't give you no trouble, he leered at the silent crowd. Let's start the bidding at $10. A small price for a good worker to cook your meals and mend your clothes. In an era that valued brute strength for the mines and the railroad, a slender Chinese woman was seen as little more than a novelty or a convenience. Too foreign, too fragile to command a high price. The men murmured, shifting their weight. One spat a stream of tobacco juice near the platform. $10 is steep for that, he grumbled. Probably doesn't even speak English. Mai kept her eyes fixed on a crack in the wooden planks beneath her bare feet. Her traditional tunic was frayed and stained with dust, her black hair pulled back in a severe, messy knot. A deep, ugly bruise colored the side of her face, a fresh reminder of her worthlessness in this new, cruel land. She had learned long ago that tears were a currency with no value here. They only invited more scorn. Then, a voice cut through the murmuring, deep and gravelly. 50. Every head swiveled. At the edge of the assembly, leaning against a rock outcropping, stood a man whose face was a roadmap of hard years. He wore a simple, dust-covered duster over worn denim, his features half hidden by the brim of a battered hat. His name was Arthur Cole, a man of 50, with a jaw that seemed permanently set and eyes that held the quiet weariness of a long, lonely winter. He held up a small pouch of coins, its weight signifying his intent. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. $50? For her? He squinted, as if trying to see if the man was drunk or mad. Arthur simply gave a short, sharp nod. The auctioneer, seeing no other bids forthcoming, slammed his hand down on a barrelhead. Sold. For $50 to the quiet fella in the back. Mai didn't flinch. She didn't look up. Life had taught her that one owner was much like the next. Arthur pushed his way through the grumbling men, his boots crunching on the dry earth. He mounted the platform and pulled off his hat, revealing a full head of graying hair. As he looked down at her, at the sharp line of her jaw and the exhaustion in her posture, his breath caught in his chest. His gaze fell to her wrist, where a small, puckered burn scar, shaped like a half-moon, was visible just below the rope. His heart hammered against his ribs. 10 years ago. He had been there. He remembered the chaos of the dynamite blast, the screams, the acrid smell of smoke. He remembered seeing her, a newly arrived bride, desperately trying to pull her husband from the wreckage, her own arm seared by a hot piece of shrapnel. He had stood frozen, a boy of 40 then, paralyzed by the sight and the authority of his own father, the foreman who had ordered the men back to work before the dead were even counted. The auctioneer gave Mai a rough shove. Go on, your new master's waiting, she stumbled, and Arthur's hand shot out to steady her. Her skin was feverish to the touch. She finally lifted her head, and her dark, almond-shaped eyes, empty of all hope, met his. He felt a tremor of a forgotten name on his lips, her husband's name, but he swallowed it down. What good would it do now? A flicker of something unreadable passed through her eyes, not recognition, but the wary assessment of a creature that had been caged for too long. She had learned that familiarity was often just a prelude to a more intimate kind of cruelty. She didn't know him, and even if a sliver of memory remained, she had buried it deep with all the other ghosts. Outside the canyon, the auctioneer's voice boomed again, selling off another soul. Arthur counted out the silver dollars, the coins heavy in his palm, and turned away, leading the silent woman who had lost everything. The dirt trail stretched before them, a long, lonely path under a sky the color of bleached bone. Mai followed a few paces behind, the frayed ropes on her wrists a silent testament to his purchase. Every rustle of her worn slippers on the gravel was an accusation, a reminder of a debt he could never truly repay. He didn't know if she would ever understand his reasons, if she would ever see him as anything but another man who owned her. As they left the canyon behind, he could feel the ghosts of the past gathering at his back. 10 years ago, his own cowardice had helped seal the fate of her husband, Lee. And now, the last remnant of that life walked behind him, a living embodiment of his failure. How could he ever ask for forgiveness from a woman who didn't even know he was the one who needed it? The road was long, the silence between them a vast, arid landscape of its own. After they had traveled for an hour, putting the grim canyon far behind them, Arthur reined in his horse. He dismounted, pulled a small, sharp knife from his belt, and approached Mai, who was riding a small, tired-looking mare he had purchased along with her. She flinched, pulling back, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look. He stopped, holding his hands up to show he meant no harm. "The ropes," he said, his voice low and rough. He gestured to her bound wrists. "Let me cut them." She watched him, her expression a mask of suspicion, but she slowly extended her hands. With a few careful slices, the rope fell away, leaving raw, red marks on her skin. "No one should be tied like an animal," he muttered, more to himself than to her, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. They continued on, the sun climbing higher, baking the earth into a cracked, brittle plate. Arthur set a slow pace, glancing back every so often. Mai rode with her head bowed, her small frame looking impossibly fragile against the immense, indifferent landscape. The only sound was the plodding of the horse's hooves and the whisper of the hot wind. He could feel her fear radiating from her like a physical force. It was in the rigid set of her shoulders, the way she never met his gaze, the way she seemed to shrink into herself every time he moved. He was just another man, another buyer, and she was bracing for the inevitable. They stopped to rest in the meager shade of a lone, twisted mesquite tree. Arthur dismounted, tethered the horses, and retrieved a canteen from his saddlebag. He walked toward her, moving slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a skittish colt. "Water," he said, holding it out. She hesitated for a long moment, her dark eyes scanning his face, searching for the trap. She had seen kindness before, and it was almost always a lie, a soft glove hiding a hard fist. Finally, with a trembling hand, she reached out and took the canteen. Her fingers brushed his, and he felt a jolt, as if he'd touched a live wire. She took a small, hesitant sip, then another, her throat working. After wiping her mouth with the back of her hand, she looked directly at him, her gaze piercing and devoid of any illusion. Her voice, when it came, was a quiet rasp, but it carried the sharp edge of shattered glass. "You paid for me," she said, her English heavily accented but clear. "Now do what you want. Get it over with." The word struck Arthur with the force of a physical blow. He felt the air leave his lungs. For a long, stunned moment, he could only stare at her. He sank to his knees in the dirt, a gesture of submission he wasn't even aware he was making, ensuring his hands were visible and empty. "Mai," he began, the name feeling foreign on his tongue. "I didn't buy you to own you. I bought you so they couldn't." A short, bitter laugh escaped her lips, a sound as dry and brittle as the dead leaves under the tree. "And you think that makes a difference?" she shot back. "A gilded cage is still a cage." He had no answer for that. There was no combination of words that could erase the humiliation of the auction block, the years of hardship she had endured. They sat in the oppressive heat, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken history. Arthur stared at his calloused hands, the dirt clinging to them like a permanent stain. "I knew your husband," he said finally, the words tearing from his throat. "Lee. He was a good man. A hard worker." Mai's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "You knew him?" "I was there," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "On the railroad. The day of the blast. I should have done something." She turned her face away, her profile a hard, unforgiving line against the pale sky. Her voice was flat, empty of all emotion. "Many men were there. They all did nothing. She stood up, still clutching the canteen, and walked back to her horse without another word. He didn't try to stop her. He watched her go, knowing he had earned every bit of her contempt. He picked up his hat, dusted it off, and followed. The sound of their horses' hoofs resumed their lonely rhythm, a hollow beat against the earth. He wondered how many suns would have to set before she stopped seeing him as a monster, or if that day would ever come. And a single, terrifying thought burned in his mind: what would she do when she finally learned the whole truth of his cowardice? By the time the last rays of sunlight were painting the distant mountains in shades of purple and orange, they arrived at his ranch. It was a modest, isolated place, a small, sturdy cabin, a barn, and a few corrals carved out of the vast, empty wilderness. It was a place where a man could lose himself, a place where the silence was so profound it could either heal a soul or drive it mad. Arthur tended to the horses, then handed Mai a piece of bread and a slice of dried meat. He gestured toward the cabin. "You can stay in there," he said simply. "It's safe." She paused at the threshold, her eyes quickly taking in the Spartan interior: a single cot, a cold stove, a rough-hewn table. She looked from the bed to him, her unspoken question hanging in the air. "I sleep in the barn," he clarified, his voice flat. She seemed to relax a fraction of an inch, then stepped inside, her movement slow and cautious, like a wild thing testing a new den. For several days, a fragile, unspoken truce settled over the ranch. They existed in parallel orbits, rarely speaking, never touching. Mai took over the cabin, cleaning it with a fierce, silent energy. She hauled water from the well, washed his few meager dishes, and mended a tear in his shirt, leaving it folded neatly on his saddle. Arthur spent his days outdoors, repairing fences that had been neglected for too long, reshoeing his horse, losing himself in the familiar, mindless rhythm of physical labor. He tried not to watch her, but he was always aware of her presence, a quiet, sorrowful shadow moving at the edge of his world. They were two ghosts, haunting the same patch of lonely ground. But in the west, peace was a fleeting commodity. On the fourth morning, a cloud of dust on the horizon signaled the arrival of riders. Arthur saw them long before they reached the ranch, his hand instinctively going to the pistol holstered at his hip. 3 men. The man in the lead wore the tarnished star of a sheriff. Sheriff Harding, a man whose brand of justice was for sale to the highest bidder. He was the law in these parts, which meant he was the one who profited most from the misery of others, including the illegal auction in the canyon. Harding swung down from his horse, a cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Well now, Arthur Cole. Didn't figure you for the social type." His gaze slid past Arthur, fixing on Mai as she stood frozen by the water pump. He squinted, his eyes tracing her features, then landing on the faint burn scar on her wrist. Recognition dawned, and his smirk widened. I remember this one. From the railroad camp. Her husband was the one who got himself blown up. Caused a whole lot of trouble." Mai's knuckles turned white where she gripped the pump handle. Arthur moved, positioning himself squarely between her and the sheriff. "You've got no business here, Harding," he said, his voice a low rumble. Harding laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Just checking on new property acquisitions in my county. Didn't know you were in the market for imported goods. She keep your bed warm at night, Cole?" Arthur didn't even blink, but the air grew heavy and still, the kind of charged silence that precedes lightning. "I paid for her freedom," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Not her body." "Freedom." Harding scoffed, taking a step closer, his hand dropping to rest on the butt of his gun. "That's a mighty noble word for it. But you see, her kind ain't got a right to freedom. Her husband's debt still stands with the railroad company. Technically, she's their property. And they pay me to retrieve what's theirs." It was a lie, a flimsy pretext he'd invented on the spot to justify his intimidation. Mai's breath caught in her throat. She remembered Harding from the camp, the way he'd walked through the workers' tents, his eyes filled with contempt and greed. Silence had been her only shield then, and it was her shield now. Arthur's jaw tightened until a muscle jumped. "She's under my protection." Harding chuckled, a low, menacing sound. He reached into his coat, but instead of his gun, he pulled out a single, gleaming brass cartridge. He placed it deliberately on the top rail of the fence separating them. "Just a friendly reminder, Cole," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some debts never get paid. And some people are better off staying lost." With a final, lingering glare at Harding and his men mounted up and rode away, leaving a trail of dust and a palpable sense of dread. The silence they left behind was heavier than before. Mai walked over to the fence, picked up the bullet, and turned it over and over in her small hand. "Who was that man?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Arthur didn't look at her. He stared out at the horizon, at the mountains where the railroad had cut its brutal path through the rock. "Trouble," he said. He knew this wasn't the end. Harding was like a coyote. Once he caught a scent, he wouldn't give up easily. And when he returned, he would be coming for more than just money. That night, the wind howled around the small cabin, rattling the window panes like a restless spirit. It was a wind that carried the scent of distant rain and the chill of old sorrows. Arthur sat at the small table, nursing a cup of coffee, the flickering lamplight casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Mai sat on a stool by the cold hearth, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face a pale oval in the gloom. The sheriff's visit had shattered the fragile peace between them, replacing it with a tense, unspoken understanding of their shared danger. After a long stretch of silence, Mai rose from her stool. She reached into a small cloth bundle she kept by her mat and pulled something out. She walked to the table and placed it gently in the center of the rough-hewn wood. It was a small jade pendant, cracked down the middle, the stone a pale, milky green. The initials LWs were faintly scratched into its surface. She pushed it toward him with one slender finger. "You said you knew my husband," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Did you know this?" Arthur's hand, reaching for his cup, froze. His gaze dropped to the pendant, and the world seemed to fall away. He remembered it. He remembered Lee showing it to him once, beaming with pride. A wedding gift for his Mai. A promise of protection and prosperity in a new land. "I found it in his pocket after the blast," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "I have kept it for 10 years. Every time I was sold, every time I was moved, I kept it hidden. It was the last piece of him I had." She looked up, and her eyes, luminous in the lamplight, bored into his. "You were there. I know you were. Tell me what you saw. Tell me the truth." Arthur stared into the lamp's flame, the fire twisting and writhing like the memories in his head. He could feel the heat on his face, smell the phantom scent of smoke and scorched earth. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, broken thing. Each word was an agony, a stone he had carried for a decade. "My father," he began, "was the foreman. He was pushing the crew too hard, cutting corners on safety to meet a deadline. Using old, unstable dynamite. Lee, your husband," he spoke up. "He told my father it was too dangerous, that the rock was unstable. He was trying to protect the other men." He paused, swallowing against the tightness in his throat. "My father called him a coward and ordered him to set the charge himself. I was there. I was standing right there. I was young, foolish. I saw the look in Lee's eyes. He knew. And I knew. But I was terrified of my father. So I said nothing. I just stood there and watched him walk toward that rock face." He finally looked at her, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it was almost a physical presence in the room. "I was a coward. I let a good man die because I was afraid. I ran from that place, from my father, from myself. But I never forgot his face. Or yours." Mai didn't speak. She slowly reached out, her fingers closing around the cracked jade pendant. Her knuckles were white, her hand trembling. For a moment, he thought she might throw it at him, or into the fire, to burn away the last vestige of that terrible day. "You think telling me this absolves you?" she asked, her voice a razor's edge. "No," he said, his voice cracking. "Nothing can do that. But you deserve to know the kind of man you were living with. They sat in the charged silence, the howling wind their only companion. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low, mournful groan from the heavens. After what felt like an eternity, Mai spoke again, her voice barely a whisper. "My husband is dead. My life was stolen. Your guilt, it changes nothing for me." Arthur looked down at his hands. "I know." "Then why," she pressed, a flicker of genuine confusion in her eyes. "Why by me? Why tell me this now?" He met her gaze, his own tired eyes holding hers. "Because for 10 years, I have done nothing. And when I saw you on that platform, I knew I couldn't do nothing again. Because I owe him. And because I'm still breathing, and he's not." The fire in the lamp sputtered. Mai stared at him, at this broken man who had carried the weight of his inaction like a shroud. And for the first time since he had bought her, the hard wall of her anger began to show the faintest of cracks. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even understanding. It was just the smallest fissure in a decade of pure, unadulterated hate. But before another word could be spoken, a new sound pierced the noise of the storm. The distinct, urgent drumming of a horse's hooves, coming fast, coming straight for the cabin. Arthur was on his feet in an instant, grabbing the rifle from its pegs on the wall. The past didn't just knock. Sometimes, it kicked the door down. The sound of the horse faded as quickly as it came, a phantom rider swallowed by the storm. It was a warning, a deliberate act of intimidation by Harding or his men. The rest of the night passed in a tense vigil. Grant stood by the door, rifle in hand, while Mai sat by the hearth, the jade pendant held tight in her fist. The silence between them had shifted again. It was no longer a chasm of anger and guilt, but the shared, quiet watchfulness of two people facing a common threat. When the sun finally rose, the world was washed clean. The rain had settled the dust, and a soft, fragile light spilled across the land. Arthur went out to the corral to check on the horses, his movements stiff from the long night. He didn't hear Mai approach until she was right behind him. "The fence by the north pasture is down," she said. Her tone was flat, a simple statement of fact. He turned, surprised. She held out a hammer he'd left by the woodpile. "It will not fix itself." Without another word, she walked toward the pasture. He watched her for a moment, then followed. They worked together for hours under the cool morning sky, their movements falling into a natural, unspoken rhythm. He'd set a post, she'd hand him the nails. He'd stretch the wire, she'd hold it steady. There was no need for talk, only the percussive sound of the hammer, the scrape of wood, and the sigh of the wind. In the shared language of work, something new was being built between them, something stronger than the fence. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. It was something more fundamental, a shared purpose. Later that week, Arthur spent an evening carefully carving a small wooden tablet. The next day, he cleared a small, respectful space under the lone mesquite tree where they had first stopped. He built a small, simple stone cairn. When Mai saw him, she walked over, her expression unreadable. He placed the wooden tablet upon the stones. He had carved Lee's name into it, the characters rough but recognizable. "It's not much," he said quietly. "But a man should have a place to be remembered." Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down Mai's face. They were the first tears he had ever seen her shed, tears she had held back for 10 long years. She knelt before the makeshift shrine, her fingers gently tracing the carved name of her husband. She wept silently, for the man she had lost, for the life that had been stolen, and for the simple, unexpected kindness of this gesture. After a long time, she stood up. She walked back to Arthur, her face streaked with tears but her eyes clear. She opened her hand and held out the cracked jade pendant. "It belongs here," she said softly. "With him." He shook his head. "No. It's all you have left of him." A small, weary smile touched her lips. "He is not in a stone," she said, her voice finding a strength he hadn't heard before. "He is here." She touched her heart. "Let it stay here. A reminder for both of us." That night, she didn't retreat to her corner of the cabin. She sat at the table across from him, sipping a cup of tea he had made. And for the first time, Arthur felt the immense, crushing weight on his soul begin to lift, not gone, but lighter. The days that followed fell into a new pattern. She planted a small garden with seeds she'd found in an old sack. He taught her how to handle a rifle, her aim surprisingly steady. She taught him the names of the stars in her own language. They were two solitary people, scarred by the past, finding a quiet, fragile sanctuary in the vast emptiness of the West. The ghost of Sheriff Harding still loomed, a threat on the horizon. But the ghosts that had haunted the ranch itself, the ghosts of regret and anger, were beginning to fade. Forgiveness, Arthur realized, wasn't a pardon granted in a single moment. It was a slow, quiet thing, like the way the stubborn desert grass pushes its way through scorched earth after a fire. It was a choice made every day, in small acts of work, of respect, of shared silence. And perhaps, that was the only way a person could ever truly find their way home.